It's late afternoon and I'm just enjoying a nice cup of red bush tea. Now, if I asked you about my cup and said, how much tea is in my cup? I wonder what you'd answer. My guess is there would be some of you who say it's half full. There would be others who say it's half empty. And that is sometimes used to describe an attitude in life, isn't it? For some people, everything's half full. They're very positive. For some people, everything's half empty. They're very negative. There's another way of looking at this. Years ago, I came across a badge that I thought was a very appropriate badge to give to some members of the congregation where I was serving. So I bought it. I took it along on a Sunday morning and teased the congregation that I was going to pick someone out and present the badge to them, and they'd have to wear it for the rest of the service. Now, the badge itself is lost. After many moves and many years, I have no idea what happened to it. So I've remade it as a postcard. Here it is. Behind every silver lining, there is a dark cloud. That's what the badge said, and it had very similar clouds to it. Of course, I didn't present it to anyone. It would have been very rude. But it does symbolise an attitude, doesn't it? That we sometimes are just very negative, that every silver lining actually has a dark cloud behind it. When you read John's Gospel, there's at least one, there are probably many more, there's at least one of his disciples who takes that kind of attitude. The person is Thomas. He appears at least 4 times in the story, and each time, at least 3 of the times, he takes a very negative attitude. The first time is in chapter 11. Jesus has just heard that his friend Lazarus is sick and on the point of death. And Jesus determines, despite the fact that the Jewish leaders are looking out for him and would like to arrest him and execute him, Jesus determines to go to Bethany. And Thomas wants to go with him. Not with the expectation that Jesus can do something wonderful in this situation, but rather with this expectation. He says, let us go with him so we can die with him. And then in chapter 14, Jesus is explaining to his disciples that he will have to go away. He says he's going to his Father's house and he's going to prepare a place for his people. And he also adds that he will come back and take them there so that they can be with him. But Thomas speaks up straight away and says, Lord, we do not know where you're going, so how can we know the way? He hasn't really grasped the fact that Jesus is who he says he is, the Son of God. He hasn't grasped the fact that he will have an eternal kingdom. And he hasn't grasped the fact that Jesus will come back for his people and take them to that eternal home. Jesus, in response, of course, utters those very famous words, I am the way, I am the truth, and I am the life. The third time we meet Thomas, it's in our chapters for this week, chapter 20. You remember, the disciples had met together on the day of the resurrection. They'd been talking about all the things that they'd heard, and then suddenly in the middle of them, Jesus appears. There are only 10 of them because Judas has left them, the betrayer has gone, and Thomas, for whatever reason, isn't there with them. Jesus speaks with them, shows them evidence of his resurrection, and then goes away again. Later, we presume it's later that night, Thomas turns up and he hears this story from the disciples. They talk about the resurrection. But Thomas, with a negative frame of mind, doesn't believe it. He says, no, I want to see for myself those nail prints in his hands and that spear thrust in his side. Thomas has spent 3 years with these 10 men. He's known them well, he's worked with them, he's followed Jesus as part of Jesus' band of disciples. And yet, he doesn't trust what they have to say. He wants evidence himself. Now, to be fair to Thomas, what he wants isn't a bad thing. He wants to know that the Jesus they're talking about isn't some hallucination. He isn't a vision that they've seen. He's real. He is the bodily Jesus that they knew before the crucifixion. But that body has had to suffer the nail prints and the spear thrust. And he wants to know it really is him, that this is a bodily resurrection. Now that's a great thing to know, because actually it's a bodily resurrection that Jesus promises to all of us, that we will be made new, but we will be recognisably the same. Now, one of the wonderful things of this story, which I sometimes miss as I read it, is of course that Jesus must have been present in some way to know exactly what Thomas was asking, what Thomas was demanding. Because the next Sunday, when they're all together and Thomas is with them, Jesus says to Thomas, look, you can put your fingers in these nail prints, you can thrust your hand in the wound in my side. They're real. This is me. It truly is me, the Jesus that you've known all along, the Jesus who died. He's the one that has risen again. And that is the evidence that Thomas wants. Actually, it doesn't say that he touched those wounds. What it does say is that he immediately acknowledges Jesus for who he is. He says to him, my Lord and my God. And of course, in a way, that brings the Gospel of John to its climax, because just a few verses later, we're going to hear John say again that he's written these things so that we may believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God. Look at verse 31 of chapter 20 carefully as you read it and compare it with what Thomas says. So Thomas gets his answer, and he's blessed because he has seen. But we now stand in Thomas's place when we listen to the testimony of the disciples. And the question for us is, will we believe? Will we understand that this resurrection is a bodily one? About 20 years ago, Tim Keller suffered from cancer of the thyroid, and wonderfully it was cured and cleared up, and he went on to have 20 years of fruitful ministry. Just very recently he's written a new book. It's called this, Hope in Times of Fear. And as it opens, he tells us that although he was cured from cancer once, he now has pancreatic cancer and faces a much more difficult treatment and a much less certain outcome. But when he closes the book, he says something I think that's very important for all of us. Let me just read a little bit to you. He says he knows of a chronically ill woman who, whenever someone asks her, oh, you really do suffer a great deal, how do you feel about it? She always says this: it's nothing that the resurrection won't cure. It's nothing that the resurrection won't cure. Now, there's a hope that Thomas embraced because he acknowledged Jesus as his Lord and his God, and that meant it was a hope that was real for him. So as we come to the resurrection accounts ourselves this Easter, let's look at them in that new light, glad that there's nothing that the resurrection won't cure.